Hello everyone, I'm Mike Dennison, Chief Political Reporter for the Montana Television Network, also known as MTN. MTN owns 9 stations across the state, including one in each of our 7 largest cities, primarily the CBS affiliates in those cities. I've been at this job for about 5 years, and before that I spent 33 years as a reporter, mostly in Montana for newspapers and wire services. Since 1992, I've been a full-time political reporter, covering politics, campaigns, state government, public policy, energy, the prison system, money in politics, healthcare, lots of issues that face the state on a daily basis. Today my talk is going to be on the political landscape of Montana and how it's changed in the last 4 decades, and how this year, 2020, is really a pivotal election in Montana politics. And by the time you watch this, the election may be over. And we'll kind of talk about the big races and what they mean. But before that, I want to talk about how we came from 1980 to the present day in Montana politics, and how as I said, the landscape has sort of shifted. Now, when I first came to Montana in 1977, I came here as a transfer student from Seattle, which is where I grew up. I was attending the University of Washington. I transferred to the University of Montana. And in that year, in 1977, I thought to myself, I'm coming to Montana, it's probably pretty conservative, and my friends all kind of ribbed me saying, you're going to redneck Montana, you're going to cowboy country, those sorts of things that we still hear today as kind of cliches about Montana. But when I got here, what I found was not conservative Montana. What I found was a place where in 1977, Democrats held pretty substantial majorities in both houses of the legislature. The governor was a Democrat, and both of our U.S. senators were Democrats. In fact, we'd only had one Republican U.S. senator in Montana in the previous 75 years. And one of the 2 congressional members, we had 2 congressional districts then, also was a Democrat. So Democrats pretty much ruled the roost. And they had seats in the legislature in all kinds of places where they would never win them today, in the Bitterroot, up in the Flathead, along the High Line, and in eastern Montana, places like Glendive and Miles City had Democratic legislators representing those areas. It had also been 5 years since Montana had passed its 1972 Constitution, considered probably one of the more liberal progressive constitutions in the country. So why did Democrats enjoy this position of power in Montana at that time? Well, probably one of the main reasons was the strength of organized labor. Throughout the state, we had unionized mines, we had unionized timber mills, we had union railroad shops all across the state, and this is kind of the bedrock of the Democrats' power at the time. But starting in about 1980, there's kind of been a slow decline of the power of the Democratic Party in the state for a lot of reasons. And let's talk about what those reasons are. In 1977, we had 800,000 people in the state. Now we have more than 1 million. I think beginning in the 80s and into the 90s as well, a lot of people started moving into Montana, into the remote, beautiful parts of western Montana. And I think a lot of those people were more conservative than the people living here. They were moving here from California and Washington, Oregon, places like that. And I think a lot of these people were escaping the cities, and they were more conservative. And that started kind of a conservative movement in the state. Number 2, we had the erosion of natural resource jobs. You may remember in 1980, we had the Anaconda Company, the Atlantic Richfield, which had bought the Anaconda Company 3 years earlier, shut down entirely the smelting operation in Great Falls and Anaconda, shut down some of the mines in Butte. And following that, we had shutdowns in a lot of timber mills throughout in the 1980s and into the 90s. Also railroad shops. All these were union shops, big unionized workforces, and so they started going away. So some of that decline is blamed on environmentalists who identify with the Democratic Party. So we have a lot of union members, former union members, and rural voters looking at their good-paying jobs going away. And who do they blame? Democrats. The Democrats kind of held their own through a lot of the 1980s, but then in 1988 we had the election of Republican U.S. Senator Comrade Burns, the first Republican U.S. Senator in Montana in about, I think, 30-some years. And we also had a Republican governor elected that year, and then the election of Mark Roscoe in 1992, also a Republican, and Republicans controlled the governor and both houses of the legislature starting in 1994 for the first time in many, many years. And that kind of gave them a foothold in the state, gave them some organizing power, which I think they've kind of built on since then. Then it still kind of was a bit of a draw because we had Democratic governors being elected in after Roscoe was gone in 2004, Roscoe and Judy Martz. But then came 2010, which I think was a big election year where Democrats had some significant losses. At the time, the House was tied 50-50 in Montana, and Republicans picked up 18 seats in that election, and they've never looked back. What happened in 2010? A couple of things. One was the unpopularity of Obamacare, which the Republicans played upon. And it's kind of ironic that that's now become a little bit more popular, but then it was not, because it really hadn't taken effect. People really didn't know what it was, and Republicans slammed it as kind of a partisan takeover of health care, and that enabled them to win a lot of races. But also, in 2010, we had Citizens United. Citizens United is the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that kind of opened the floodgates for all kinds of money to come into politics. And one of the things that happened after that, nationally, Republicans used that money to organize on a local level and try to take and shift and take over a lot of Republican legislatures. I'm not sure that happened in Montana that year, but it happened in a lot of states around the country in 2010 that also enabled them to take control of the legislatures and to control redistricting in the state. Now, that's not the case in Montana. In Montana, we have a redistricting commission, which is not the legislature or partisan controlled. And so that wasn't a big factor here. But at the same time, that huge gain that Republicans had in the legislature, picking up 18 seats, they've never really given it back. They've given maybe a few here and there, but it really kind of cemented their control of the legislature. And finally, we had the retirement of U.S. Senator Max Baucus, a Democrat, in 2014. Baucus was in power for essentially 40 years, and he was rarely opposed by a strong opponent. So during all these election years, he would raise all this money, and he'd have some money lying around. He'd assign his staff to go work on Democratic legislative races around the state. So the loss of Baucus was kind of a loss of a source of power and a source of money for the Democratic Party. And then, of course, after he left, a Republican, Steve Daines, won his seat. And so that kind of took away that little pillar of power as well. Then we have the election of 2016. At the top of the ticket, Donald Trump, the Republican. Hillary Clinton, very unpopular in Montana. And Republicans win every statewide race except the governor. And even that was pretty close. This is when Steve Bullock defeated Greg Gianforte in 2016. But I think that race installed Republicans in all these seats and also showed that Republicans really are kind of becoming the dominant party in the state. And that's why I think 2020 is going to be such a pivotal election for the state. If Greg Gianforte wins, Republicans will control the legislature and the governor's seat for only the second time in the last 75 years. And it's quite possible they could win all the other seats as well. We have the U.S. Senate race, we have the U.S. House race, we have all the other races up and down the ticket, Attorney General, State Auditor, OPI, the Secretary of State. A lot of these seats are open. It's possible Republicans could sweep all these seats and control everything. But at the same time, they could lose a few. There's a lot of money being raised by Democrats for this election, U.S. Senate and U.S. House and other races as well. And so it's possible that they could win a few of these seats and kind of stave off the Republican takeover of the state on a statewide basis. Whether that's going to happen or whether it already has happened, we'll see. But that's why I see 2020 as being a real pivotal election for kind of the future, kind of the profile of the state in terms of politics. I'd also like to talk just briefly about my book, which is called Inside Montana Politics, A Reporter's View from the Trenches, published last year by the History Press. What I did is I wanted to take a look back at my career and take a look at major stories and figures that I'd covered during my 30 years as a political reporter before this time. And when I was thinking about how I would do this, I didn't really see any other book out there about this time period, certainly not by any other journalist. And so the way I decided to organize it was around the major political figures and events that I covered. And I did this because the best nonfiction that I've read usually is revolving around people, around characters, like characters in a novel. And I really think that the people you cover and the people in history, kind of their characteristics and where they fit into the picture, that's what makes it interesting. Rather than just talking about events and talking about trends in history, I'd rather focus on the people. And that's why I picked the people I did. Senator Max Baucus, Senator John Tester, Senator Conrad Burns, also 3 governors, Judy Martz, Mark Roscoe, and Brian Schweitzer. I also threw in a couple of chapters about some big stories that I covered, such as the prison riot back in 1991, and another story, a criminal justice story about a fellow, Cody Marble, who I believe was falsely convicted. I wrote about how I kind of exposed what happened to him and how it led eventually to his exoneration. But what I want to talk about today is the first chapter, and that chapter is about the fall of Montana Power Company back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. From the first time that I started thinking about writing this book, Montana Power was always going to be the first chapter. That's because it's probably the biggest political and economic story that I've covered in my career. I wrote hundreds of stories about it. It's had a huge impact on the state, and it was a fascinating tale of how politics works in the state and how something that you could see was maybe not the best idea, but still the powers that be and wanted to make it happen, so it happened. And of course, it had disastrous consequences for a lot of people in the state. As you'll see if you read the book, it's one of these stories that I just almost stumbled into. I mean, I'd covered Montana Power a little bit, but not really. And then one day I got a call from this guy. He was an attorney in Helena. His name was Mike Uda. He's an energy lawyer. And he was writing about some natural gas producers having some problems with Montana Power. And so I kind of started looking into this. And this was the step in the door in me thinking, maybe not all is well with some of the things that this company is doing. And that led to, about a year later, Montana Power was ready to launch what they called restructuring of their business, commonly called deregulation. And Mr. Uda was one of the people who told me, this is a big deal, you need to cover it. And I worked for the Great Falls Tribune at the time as their Capitol Bureau reporter. And I told my editors about this, and they said, yeah, we need to get on this. And so that's kind of how it started. In the first week of the 1997 legislature, which is when the deregulation bill passed, I wrote a story for the Tribune saying, this is the sleeper issue of the session. And that's exactly what happened. Let's talk a little bit about what restructuring is. The traditional model of most utilities at the time was, and Montana Power included, was a vertically integrated utility. And that means that they control all the elements of generating power. They control the coal, they control the coal generating plants, they control the hydro plants, they generate the power, they generate the stuff they own the stuff that goes into the plants, they transmit the power along the power lines that they own and with the system they own and deliver it to you, the consumer, be you residential or business, and they charge you a bundled rate for all that power. Well, what Montana Power wanted to do is they said, okay, we're going to break this up and we're going to separate out the power generation and we're just going to be running the distribution. And so there'll be competition for the power generation amongst the consumers. So there'll be people out there be building power plants here and there, and you can buy from them, and they can compete for your business, and we'll just deliver the power. Now I heard this pitch and I thought, wait a minute, we're talking about Montana, which is probably the smallest, most remote market in the lower 48 states. And you're telling me that people are going to build giant power plants, which take a lot of money to invest in, to compete for the smallest market in the country. It just didn't make any sense to me. And we already had some of the lowest power rates in the country. But the big industrial consumers in the state, they were behind this, as well as Montana Power. They were looking around the region and saying power prices that were lower than they were paying Montana Power, because they were kind of subsidizing a lot of the smaller residential customers with their rates. And they said, hey, we want to go out there and buy this stuff on the market and compete. And Montana Power said, okay, well, we'll try that. So you had the big industrial consumers, you had the Republicans in the legislature all on board, a lot of the Democrats, because some of the Democrats were from Butte, the headquarters of Montana Power. The governor was a Republican, Mark Roscoe, and so this thing was pretty much greased. So what happened? Within a year after this bill passed, Montana Power announces it's going to sell off all of its power plants, all these plants that were generating us very cheap power, to the highest bidder. Pennsylvania Power and Light is the one that bought it. And then they're going to sell that power back to us through Montana Power at a market rate. It was frozen for a while, but after that freeze came off, it was market prices. And of course, a lot of things went wrong with the market right at that time. Then, within a year or two after that, Montana Power decided it was going to sell off not only its power plants, but also its coal mines and its gas production lines and its transmission lines and everything to do with power, and convert itself to a telecom company, Touch America. And it decided to do this at one of the most volatile moments in the telecom industry and telecom industry history, right when the internet is taking off, cell phones are exploding. So here's Montana Power leaving a business it had been in for 80, 90 years, it knew very well, jumping off the cliff into the shark-filled waters of the new telecom revolution. And as you recall, it didn't go well. That's just one chapter of the book. There are many more. If you want to get a copy, it's available at local bookstores, or you can get a copy directly from me. I'll sign it for you. And if you like a copy, you can send me an email at MikeDennison5@gmail.com, and we can arrange that to happen. That's my talk for today. If there's anything you want to ask me about Montana politics, just send me a note. I'll be glad to respond. Thanks again for listening.